It was June of 1944. The fields of Normandy were soaked with rain and blood. Columns of captured German soldiers shuffled along muddy roads under the grey sky, boots caked with dirt uniforms, torn faces blank. Up ahead, American infantry stood guard. Their uniforms were dry. Their boots looked new, rows of them, identical shining tightly laced leather, as if each man had just stepped out of a factory line. A few of the Germans whispered among themselves. "How?" one murmured. "How do they never run out?" To them, the sight was almost surreal. In their own army, boots were repaired, resoled, scavenged from the dead. Some wore mismatched pairs, others tied theirs together with wire. But these Americans, even in the mud of battle, had fresh gear clean. Rations, endless supplies. That quiet moment in a captured column revealed something deeper than pride or envy. It revealed the hidden engine of the Allied war effort, a machine of logistics so vast, so precise, that it seemed to make scarcity itself disappear. While generals drew arrows on maps and tanks rumbled across Europe, another kind of battle was being fought behind the lines, the war of production, distribution, and endurance. And sometimes the proof of that victory wasn't seen in a tank or a bomber. It was seen in a pair of boots. For the captured German soldiers that marched through the Norman countryside was more than humiliation. It was revelation. They had fought fiercely for years, believing discipline and experience could outmatch material advantage. But as they trudged past American convoys, they began to understand what they were really up against. Truck after truck rolled by, each stacked with crates of supplies, uniforms, ammunition, food. And yes, boots, fresh pairs still in their boxes, labeled and numbered for distribution. The Americans didn't repair boots in the field, they replaced them. It was unthinkable to the men of the Wehrmacht. Many of them had marched across Russia in winter with their soles split, open, wrapping their feet in rags to keep from freezing. By 1944, German production was collapsing under Allied bombing. Leather was scarce, transportation unreliable. The once mighty war machine was running on fumes. Now, as prisoners, these men saw the abundance of the US Army with their own eyes. Each GI carried not only new boots but spare laces, socks, and even waterproof leggings. They looked, as one captured officer wrote later, like soldiers from another planet. The boots were more than footwear. They were proof, the proof of an industrial power that didn't tire, didn't falter, and didn't run out. What the Germans didn't know yet was that these boots were part of something far larger, a logistical miracle built long before the first shot was fired. The American soldier's boot was not just a piece of leather, it was a symbol of industrial genius and foresight. By the time the Allies stormed Normandy in 1944, the US Army had already perfected its footwear, the service shoe type 2, and later the improved combat boot double buckle. Each pair was a triumph of efficiency. Durable leather uppers, rubber soles, reinforced stitching, all built to survive mud, snow, and salt water. They weren't custom-made like pre-war European boots. They were standardized identical from one soldier to the next. That sameness wasn't a flaw, it was the secret to the American system. Because when every boot fit the same, every replacement fit perfectly. If a GI's boots wore out, he didn't need a cobbler. He just opened a new box. Factories across the United States produced them by the millions, over 40 million pairs between 1941 and 1945. From the tanneries of Chicago and St. Louis to the Goodyear plants in Ohio, the effort spanned the entire nation. Small-town shoemakers were contracted by the Quartermaster Corps, each following one precise blueprint down to the last stitch. While the Wehrmacht begged for materials, the US Army standardized everything: eyelets, soles, even the color of the dye. Each box of boots could be shipped, stored, and distributed anywhere in the world without confusion. The result was astonishing. An American soldier landing in Normandy could receive the same boots as a Marine fighting in the jungles of the Pacific. That kind of interchangeability was unheard of in warfare. German boots, by contrast, were often hand-cut and crafted from dwindling supplies. Soviet boots were issued in odd sizes, with soldiers swapping pairs until one fit. But for the Americans, every man had what he needed, not because of luck, but because of planning. The combat boot became a quiet icon of the war. It didn't roar like a tank or soar, like a bomber, but it never stopped marching. Each one was a promise that the man wearing it would not be abandoned by his army, and that reliability, that unbroken chain of supply, was no accident. It was the work of an organization that turned logistics into an art form. Behind every American soldier on the front line stood an invisible army, not of fighters but of movers, the Quartermaster Corps. Their battlefield was not a trench or a city. It was the endless line of ships, trucks, railroads, and depots that kept the U.S. military fed, clothed, and armed from 1942 to 1945. It began with numbers, millions of them. Every man, every uniform, every bullet had to be accounted for. The quartermasters didn't rely on luck or improvisation. They used data schedules and tracking long before computers existed. When an infantry division landed in France, it wasn't just men and rifles, it was an ecosystem. Each division arrived with its own supply pipeline: food, fuel, spare parts, and of course, boots. Every single item had a destination and a replacement schedule. The German army, by comparison, was still moving supplies by horse cart. Even in 1944, over 70% of the Wehrmacht's logistics depended on horses. When the Allies bombed railways or depots, German supply lines collapsed, but the Americans had redundancy. If one route was destroyed, another opened instantly. And then came the Red Ball Express, the lifeline of Europe. From August to November of 1944, of trucks thundered across the continent, 24 hours a day, delivering fuel rations, ammunition, and clothing from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines. Drivers barely slept. Roads were jammed weather. Brutal, but the flow never stopped. Each Red Ball truck carried its own load, manifest. And yes, among the crates were thousands of boxes labelled footwear combat. Every 2 weeks, new shipments arrived at field depots. No soldier went long without. Replacements. A GI could tear his boots on barbed wire one day and receive a fresh pair the next, to a German prisoner watching from behind a fence that looked like sorcery. But it wasn't magic. It was logistics. The same system that moved those boots could move tanks, fuel, and medicine. It was built not on conquest, but on coordination, a quiet victory in the background of the war. Because while soldiers fought with courage, it was the supply chain that ensured they could keep fighting at all. Long before the beaches of Normandy, before American troops even fired a shot in Europe, another kind of mobilization had already begun, not on the battlefield, but on the factory floor. In 1941, when President Roosevelt called America the arsenal of democracy, he wasn't exaggerating. From coast to coast, factories shifted from civilian production to military supply. Car plants began building tanks, typewriter companies made machine gun parts, and shoe manufacturers. They turned into the Army's beating heart of leather and rubber. The War Production Board took control of every step, from the cattle that provided the hides to the rail cars that carried the finished boots. Tanneries ran day and night. Chemical companies developed new tanning processes that could turn raw leather into tough, weatherproof material in half the time. When Japan seized Southeast Asia, cutting off much of the world's natural rubber, American scientists invented synthetic substitutes, keeping boot soles rolling off assembly lines. Without pause, nothing was left to chance. In Massachusetts, old cobbler towns like Lynn and Brockton became boot-making hubs once again. In Pennsylvania and Illinois, thousands of women entered the factories, cutting, stitching, and lacing military footwear. They worked under posters that read, "Every pair for victory." Goodyear engineers designed molds for standardized soles that could be attached in seconds. By late 1943, the United States was producing nearly 8 million pairs of combat boots every single year. Each pair was boxed, labeled, and ready for shipment, stamped with the same measurements, same inspection codes, same guarantee. That precision wasn't just about comfort, it was about scale. It meant that a soldier in New Guinea, another in Italy, and another in France could all wear the same size 10 and never notice a difference. Even the packaging was regulated. sturdy cardboard boxes designed to stack perfectly in cargo holds. When a Liberty ship left New York, the quartermaster knew exactly which crate held which size destined for which division. No guesswork, no waste, no running out. This was America's true superweapon, its ability to plan, produce, and deliver without interruption. Generals might have led the campaigns, but it was the men and women behind sewing machines, tanneries, and factory belts who gave the Allies endurance and the leather that covered those soldiers' feet. It was more than protection. It was the product of an industrial army that never slept. In war, morale can be as powerful as a rifle. A soldier who believes his army will take care of him fights differently. He stands taller, marches farther, endures longer. And for the American GI, that confidence began with something as simple as his boots. When he laced them up, he didn't have to wonder if they would hold together for the next march. He didn't worry about finding replacements or scavenging from fallen comrades. He knew without question that the US Army would supply him no matter where he was sent. That trust became a psychological weapon. It gave American troops a sense of permanence, of reliability, of belonging to a machine that could not break down. German and Japanese soldiers often faced the opposite. By 1944, many Wehrmacht units were supplied sporadically, their replacements delayed or lost entirely. Some wore patched-up uniforms from earlier campaigns. Others scavenged boots from civilians or fallen enemies. One German infantryman later wrote, "We fought not only the enemy but our own hunger and exhaustion." Meanwhile, American soldiers received hot meals, mail from home, dry socks and fresh equipment, luxuries in total war. The difference was not arrogance, it was organization. And that difference sank deep into the minds of captured Axis troops. As they sat behind barbed wire, they saw supply trucks rolling past every day, loaded with fresh food, fuel, and boots, even when the fighting raged miles away. They realized that while their armies had been running on desperation, the Americans seemed to run on abundance. One German officer captured after the Falaise pocket later told his interrogator, "We lost the war the moment we saw how well your soldiers were equipped. It was not bravery, we feared it was your factories." That psychological edge, the feeling that you could never exhaust the enemy, became a silent force on the battlefield. Every polished boot that stepped through the mud was a message. We can fight forever, can you? While the headlines glorified generals and tank divisions, there was another war raging, quieter, methodical, invisible. It was the war of logistics, and America fought it better than anyone in history. Across the globe, US supply lines became arteries of victory. From the steaming jungles of the Pacific to the frozen roads of Belgium, every American soldier was part of a vast system that never slept. Boots were only the first step. Behind them came uniforms, helmets, rations, medical kits, gasoline, spare parts, all moving through a web so complex that it seemed impossible it could function. But it did. The Quartermaster Corps and Army Transportation Service built what historians later called the world's first global supply network. They mapped shipping, lanes, railway junctions, and air routes like a nervous system. They created prefabricated depots, portable warehouses that could be assembled anywhere within days. Each contained standardized crates stacked in uniform rows. Clothing, weapons, replacement boots, all catalogued by code. Even the Pacific Islands became floating factories. Atolls and beaches transformed into temporary ports where Liberty ships offloaded cargo into amphibious trucks and barges. Supplies leapt from ship to shore, from depot to division, without pause. When troops advanced too quickly for the system to keep up, like after D-Day or in the breakout from Saint-Lô, the solution was simple: create new supply routes overnight. The Red Ball Express, already legendary, was only one part of this miracle. By late 1944, American trucks were moving over 12,000 tons of supplies every single day across France, alone. And they did it with precision, every route color-coded, every convoy numbered, every box tracked. Some ships were even converted into floating warehouses, anchored offshore, stocked with spare parts and provisions. If a frontline unit needed replacements, They radioed in the request, and within hours, fresh supplies arrived, sometimes by parachute. It was in every sense a machine, and like any machine, its strength lay in consistency. For the men who faced it, Axis commanders, watching their own depots burn, while American lines stayed full, it was unnerving, because they were watching an enemy who never seemed to run out of anything, not fuel, not food, not boots. The logistics war had no famous battles, no medals for bravery, but without it, none of the others could have been won. It was fought by planners, engineers, and drivers, and won by the rhythm of movement itself. As the war dragged into its final year, the Axis soldiers' disbelief turned to quiet resignation. In prisoner of war camps across France and Belgium, captured German officers watched the steady rhythm of the Allied supply system, the trucks, the depots, the endless flow of fresh equipment, and finally understood they hadn't lost to a single battle, they had lost to a system. One captured quartermaster officer reportedly stared at a US storage yard in stunned silence, acres of crates stacked higher than houses, all labelled, indexed, and ready for use. He whispered, "Even if we had your tanks, we could not have fed them." When the Allies captured German depots late in the war, they found chaos. Supplies mislabeled, shipments missing, trucks without fuel, and soldiers without shoes. The Wehrmacht had once been an efficient machine, but by 1944 it was starving from within. Factories were in ruins, trains couldn't move, horses outnumbered trucks. By contrast, American logistics grew stronger the further the army advanced. The same system that had supplied Normandy now powered operations deep into Germany itself. Bridges destroyed by retreating, Axis troops were replaced within days by engineers. Depots moved forward overnight, following the front line like a shadow. Captured soldiers couldn't fathom it. They had believed war was won by courage and tactics, but now they saw it, the true power of a modern industrial democracy. An army that could replace what it lost faster than the enemy could destroy it. A German general interrogated in 1945 summed it up with bitter clarity. "We were not defeated by men, we were defeated by materiel and the organization that made it infinite." And as the prisoners watched those perfectly equipped American troops march past the new uniforms, the polished rifles, the boots that looked untouched by war, they realized something haunting. The Allies had built a war machine that could have kept going for decades if needed. They had fought an enemy that never seemed to tire. For the Germans standing in those muddy fields, that was the moment the illusion shattered, the moment they finally understood why they could never win back in the mud of Normandy. Those captured soldiers stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the rows of American infantry passing by. The thunder of artillery had faded for the moment, replaced by the steady rhythm of marching feet, hundreds of boots, striking the ground in perfect unison. Each step carried more than a man. It carried a nation's industry, organization, and willpower. Those boots weren't just made of leather and nails. They were made of the hands of factory workers in Chicago, and Boston of truck drivers on the Red, Ball Express of women stitching through the night in crowded workshops. They were built from the discipline of engineers who planned every shipment, the determination of sailors who crossed the Atlantic again and again under fire, and the sheer belief that nothing should ever run out. For the men who saw them, the prisoners who once believed themselves part of an invincible army, that sight was devastating. Because they weren't just looking at new footwear, they were looking at inevitability. Those boots told a story without words. That America could replace what it lost, rebuild what was destroyed, and rearm faster than anyone could imagine. They spoke of a kind of strength that didn't boast, it just kept moving forward. In the end, victory in the Second World War wasn't written only in battles or strategy. It was written in supply, manifests, factory quotas, and shipping schedules, in the quiet, relentless hum of production. And as the boots of the US Army marched across Europe, they carried more than soldiers. They carried the weight of a civilization's capacity to endure. To those captured men, that realization came too late, but for history it remains one of the war's great lessons. That sometimes the power that wins a world war isn't the one holding the rifle, It's the one that makes sure he never runs out of boots.